He didn't just interrupt her once, not twice, but 6 times. And on the 7th, he would regret it. The air in the chamber was thick, charged with the unmistakable hum of confrontation. Cameras captured every twitch, every glance, every word sharp enough to cut. And there he was, Ted Cruz, leaning forward, his voice booming, slicing through Jasmine Crockett's measured words like a blade determined to silence. The interruptions were not slips of passion. They were calculated, deliberate, dripping with a confidence that dared her to flinch. Each time he spoke over her, the room seemed to tilt further in his direction, his tone swollen with arrogance, as if he were performing for an audience outside those walls. He didn't want dialogue. He wanted dominance. But Crockett's face told another story. While his voice thundered, her eyes narrowed with quiet resolve. While his tone sought to rattle, her calm was a shield. Viewers watching at home felt the tension rise with each cutoff, 1, 2, 3, and by the 4th interruption, outrage had already begun brewing online. By the 5th, her supporters leaned forward in their seats, whispering at their screens, "Don't let him." By the 6th, it was no longer about a single exchange. It had become a symbol of something bigger, because this wasn't just about 2 politicians sparring. This was about power, respect, and whether a woman of color would be granted the space to finish her sentence in the face of a man convinced the microphone belonged to him. It was about every person who had been told to wait their turn while someone louder, richer, or more entitled spoke over them. And yet Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam the table or let her composure crack. She let the interruptions pile up, one after the other, like a tower of arrogance stacked so high it was destined to collapse. The audience could feel it. The calm before the storm, the moment before the tables turned. Because when that 7th moment came, Cruz would discover that every interruption had only set the stage for his own undoing. The nation would be talking about this for weeks. And what came next would leave even his loudest supporters stunned into silence. The setting was not some backroom argument or cable news shouting match. It was the hallowed ground of a congressional committee hearing, a place where order is supposed to prevail, where every voice is meant to be heard in turn, and where the stakes are higher than mere personal pride. The walls themselves seemed to hold the echoes of history, lined with the weight of debates that shaped the nation. This was not supposed to be about personalities. It was supposed to be about policy, truth, and accountability. But on this day, the air inside was crackling with something far more primal, a clash of ego against dignity. Ted Cruz sat with the posture of someone who believed the spotlight was his birthright. Each interruption wasn't just an argument, it was a display, a performance staged for cameras, headlines, and sound bites. His voice rolled like thunder, dismissive and impatient, cutting off Crockett's words before they could find full flight. To him, the hearing was theater. To her, it was duty. And that contrast sharpened every second of the encounter. Why did this moment matter? Because it was never just about Cruz and Crockett. It was about every imbalance baked into the American political landscape. A white male senator with a long record of talking over others clashing with a black woman whose very presence challenged the status quo. Gender, race, power. It was all there, in every pause, every interruption, every attempt to bulldoze her voice. Millions watching recognized the scene instantly, not just as politics, but as life itself. The classroom where a girl's answer is drowned out by a louder boy. The office where a woman of color is asked to repeat herself because a colleague wasn't listening. The dinner table where someone's lived experience is brushed aside in favor of louder opinions. Crockett embodied something more than herself in that moment. She was standing as a proxy for all those unseen, unheard battles. And the stakes, therefore, were enormous. If she faltered, it would seem to validate every interruption. But if she held her ground, If she turned the tide, the impact would ripple far beyond the committee room. By the fourth interruption, whispers spread across the chamber. By the fifth, frustration hung heavy in the air, like the static before a lightning strike. And by the sixth, even those who had come expecting routine sparring leaned forward, realizing something unusual was brewing. This wasn't just parliamentary procedure anymore. It was spectacle. It was confrontation stripped bare, arrogance clashing with composure. People in the room began trading looks. Staffers scribbled notes not just on policy, but on performance. Journalists prepared tweets that would ignite timelines. Viewers at home sensed it too, that what they were witnessing wasn't going to end with just another talking point buried in committee transcripts. No, this was building towards something unforgettable. Because here was the truth. Arrogance can fill the air, but dignity can outlast it. And in that room, Jasmine Crockett's calm had become the quiet counterweight to Cruz's noise. It was only a matter of time before balance shifted, but no one in the room expected how Crockett would flip the script. Not the staffers who had seen countless hearings, not the reporters who thought they'd already written the story, and certainly not Ted Cruz, who was about to learn that the louder you interrupt, the harder the silence hits when it finally comes. To understand why this moment carried such a charge, you have to know the man behind the interruptions. Ted Cruz did not stumble into this role by accident. He built it brick by brick, speech by speech, interruption by interruption. For years, he has been the senator who relishes the sound of his own voice, the one who treats hearings less like opportunities for inquiry and more like arenas for his grandstanding performances. Cruz's reputation precedes him. Even in the Senate, a chamber famous for egos, colleagues have whispered about his love of the spotlight. Former staffers and fellow Republicans alike have described him as brilliant but insufferable, a man who never quite learned the art of listening. His weapon of choice has always been volume. Volume of words, volume of interruptions, volume of presence. When others see debate as exchange, Cruz sees it as conquest. And his interruptions, time and again, have been the blunt instruments of that conquest. Consider his infamous clashes during confirmation hearings, where he would grill nominees with questions designed less to elicit answers and more to showcase his ideological purity to the cameras. His interruptions often followed the same script: ask a question, cut off the response, smirk as though the half answer had already proven his point. He was not seeking clarity, he was seeking dominance. To Cruz, winning was not about the truth. It was about control of the narrative. Or think back to the government shutdown of 2013, when Cruz stood on the Senate floor reading Dr. Seuss's Green Eggs and Ham. It wasn't policy. It wasn't negotiation. It was theater designed to elevate himself as the central figure in a national drama. His colleagues, even in his own party, rolled their eyes. But Cruz didn't care. He wasn't performing for them. He was performing for the cameras, for the donors, for the headlines that would follow. Again and again, Cruz has positioned himself as the loudest voice in the room, the interrupter-in-chief, the man who equates interruption with intellect. And, in a political culture where sound bites often travel further than substance, he has thrived. But arrogance, like all excess, leaves cracks in the armor. Each interruption breeds resentment. Each grandstanding moment erodes credibility. And beneath the bravado, there's always the risk of overplaying the hand. His contradictions only sharpen the villainous outline. He fashions himself as a defender of tradition, yet he disrupts the very traditions of respectful debate. He claims to stand for the Constitution, yet his interruptions routinely bulldoze the spirit of dialogue it enshrines. He speaks of American dignity, but his tone so often strips it away from those across the table. Even beyond politics, his public persona has leaned heavily into provocation. Whether sparring on cable news or firing off combative tweets, Cruz has built a brand on being louder, sharper, and more abrasive than the rest. To his supporters, this is strength. To his critics, It is insecurity disguised as swagger. And in that committee room, it was arrogance distilled to its purest form, the belief that if he just kept cutting in, Crockett would eventually yield. But this is where the fatal flaw reveals itself, because arrogance always assumes its target is weak. It always underestimates the power of restraint, the force of calm, the strength of someone who refuses to be rattled. Cruz thought interruption number 6 would go like the others, loud, controlling, unchallenged. What he didn't realize was that each one had only set the stage, tightening the spring of anticipation, preparing the audience for the moment when silence would fall and dignity would strike back. Ted Cruz, the master interrupter, had walked into yet another performance. But this time, his chosen stage was different. His counterpart wasn't just another politician eager to trade barbs. His counterpart was Jasmine Crockett, a woman forged in struggle, trained in resilience, and uninterested in playing the part of his foil. She was not there to amplify his theater. She was there to expose it. And arrogance, as history has shown time and again, has one fatal flaw. It always underestimates calm strength. To understand why Jasmine Crockett's composure carried such weight, you have to look at the life that shaped her. Crockett was not born into political privilege. She was not groomed in the back rooms of Washington, nor did she inherit a dynasty. Her roots stretch into the grit of lived struggle, the kind that teaches you early on that nothing will ever simply be handed to you. Before politics, there was law, and before law, there was survival. Growing up, she saw firsthand the gaps in justice, the way working families were too often left voiceless, while power bent toward those with money, influence, or connections. That seed of injustice planted itself deep in her heart, and when she chose her path, it wasn't to chase prestige, it was to fight. She became a lawyer not to climb ladders, but to stand in courtrooms beside those who had no one else. Her specialty was defending the people the system preferred to forget, the poor, the vulnerable, those pushed to the margins. Every case she took built her armor. Each time she stood across from prosecutors or judges who underestimated her, she learned how to wield calm as a weapon. Not the calm of passivity, but the calm of someone who has weathered storms and knows she will weather more. She faced clients in shackles, mothers in tears, fathers with their last shred of hope resting in her hands. And in those crucibles, she found her voice. Not the loudest, not the most theatrical, but steady, unflinching, resolute. When activism called, Crockett answered. Her work stretched beyond the courtroom and into the streets, where the fight for justice was raw and immediate. She organized, she marched, she spoke for communities tired of being ignored. That combination, lawyers' precision and activists' fire, made her both dangerous and magnetic. People began to notice. The underdog was no longer invisible. She was carving a place in the arena. Politics came next, though not as ambition, but as necessity. She had seen too many battles where policy wrote the rules long before a case ever reached the courtroom. If justice was to mean anything, it had to be pursued at the highest levels. So she ran, and she won. Not because big money paved her way, but because people recognized authenticity when they saw it. In Washington, Crockett carried the same values she had carried in law: dignity, truth, service. She was never the loudest voice in the room, but she was the one who demanded attention without raising her volume. When she spoke, it was with the cadence of someone who had nothing to prove, only something to protect. That unnerved opponents, who thrived on bluster. Men like Cruz, who mistook decibels for strength. Her identity was central to her story, not as a shield, but as a source of power. A black woman in a chamber long dominated by white men, she stood as living evidence that the arc of history, slow though it may be, was bending toward inclusion. Her very presence carried a weight, and with that weight came expectations, sometimes crushing, sometimes electrifying. She knew she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every woman told to wait her turn, every community sidelined by power, every voice that had been shouted down. The struggles she faced didn't end when she earned her title. They continued in whispers behind closed doors, in dismissive tones across committee tables, in subtle and not-so-subtle attempts to box her in. But Crockett had already fought harder battles. She had already stared down systems designed to silence her. Each dismissive smirk, each interruption, each attempt to reduce her to a footnote only strengthened her resolve. And that's why, when Cruz interrupted her once, twice, 3 times, Crockett did not waver. She did not lash out in fury. She knew this pattern. She had seen it in judges, in prosecutors, in pundits who believed their voices carried more authority simply because they were louder. She had trained for this moment in every courtroom, in every march, in every battle where silence was the goal and dignity was the weapon. The irony was rich. Cruz believed his interruptions would diminish her. Instead, they highlighted her restraint, her ability to hold steady against the storm. And to those watching, progressives, immigrants, people who had lived the same dynamic in their own lives, her calm was not weakness. It was recognition. It was validation. It was proof that sometimes the strongest rebuttal is composure itself. Every struggle, every client defended, every protest led, every insult endured had carved resilience into her bones. By the time Cruz leaned in with his 7th interruption, Crockett was not rattled. She was ready. And it was those very battles that prepared her for what was about to unfold. The first interruption came quickly, sharp as a gavel strike. Jasmine Crockett began her sentence with steady composure, outlining her point with a lawyer's precision, when Ted Cruz leaned in, his voice cutting across hers like a blade. "But that's not what the data shows," he thundered, waving, his hand as though the very act of speaking louder made him right. Crockett paused, lips pressed together, her eyes flicking in his direction. She gave him space to finish, the courtesy of silence, and then she resumed, calm, measured, unshaken, but he was not done. The second interruption barreled in before she could even complete her thought. "You're ignoring the facts," Cruz declared, his tone impatient, almost performative, as though he was addressing a crowd beyond the room. Murmurs rippled across the chamber. Crockett's supporters tensed, leaning forward in their seats, willing her to push back. But she didn't. Not yet. She simply straightened her notes, her face a mask of composure, and waited again. By the third interruption, the rhythm had become obvious. She spoke. He cut in. She tried again. He overrode. The cycle repeated, building tension like a drumbeat growing louder, heavier. His voice was forceful, urgent. Hers was controlled, deliberate. It was a clash, not of words alone, but of styles, the bombast of arrogance against the steel of restraint. "Senator," she began, her voice soft but firm, "if you would let me fin—" The fourth interruption came crashing in, his voice swelling to drown hers out completely. He leaned forward in his chair, eyes gleaming with impatience, as though victory could be claimed simply by occupying the most space, making the most noise. By now, the staffers around the edges of the room were shifting uncomfortably. The contrast between the two was stark. Cruz, restless, interrupting, pressing harder with every syllable. Crockett, unyielding in her calm, absorbing the blows without breaking. By the fifth interruption, the temperature in the room had changed. The arrogance no longer looked like confidence. It looked like desperation. His hand gestures grew sharper, his tone increasingly frustrated. Meanwhile, Crockett barely moved, her stillness amplifying the imbalance between them. It was as though she had decided, let him expend his energy. Let him interrupt as many times as he wants. The more he flailed, the clearer the picture became. "Congresswoman, you're evading the question!" Cruz snapped during the sixth interruption, voice raised, eyes darting to the cameras as though seeking validation from an audience not present. His words carried the tremor of someone who believed he was winning simply by being louder. But Crockett's silence was louder still. She let the moment hang. She let the weight of his interruption settle into the air, a spotlight shining directly on his lack of patience. And when she finally opened her mouth again, her voice was so even, so controlled, that the room itself seemed to lean toward her. Those watching could feel it. Something was building, something Cruz couldn't see. He thought he was dominating the exchange. He thought he was silencing her. But in truth, every interruption was only sharpening the contrast, only making his impatience look smaller against her composure. The rhythm was undeniable now. Interruption after interruption. Arrogance. Stacking higher, calm, enduring stronger. By the sixth time, the chamber no longer buzzed with curiosity. It hummed with anticipation. Reporters' pens froze mid-sentence. Even his allies shifted, sensing the imbalance, because the audience, whether in that room or watching from afar, could tell what Cruz could not. Arrogance has its limits, and dignity was waiting just beyond them. And so, as Cruz leaned forward once more, his voice rising for the seventh time, the tension snapped into clarity. This would not be just another interruption. This would be the moment when arrogance met its match, but interruption number 7 would silence even him. The seventh interruption came like the others, loud, impatient, and dripping with the arrogance of a man convinced that volume alone could secure victory. Ted Cruz leaned in, his voice echoing through the chamber. "You're dodging again, Congresswoman. The American people can see it." His words were clipped, his tone sharp, and his hand slapped against the table as if punctuation itself could silence her. But this time, Jasmine Crockett did not simply wait him out. She let the sound of his interruption hang for a moment, as if she were studying it, as if she were deciding exactly how much weight to give it. Her silence became heavier than his thunder. The pause stretched long enough that even Cruz, who thrived on momentum, faltered for half a second. And then, slowly, with a steadiness that commanded the entire room, Crockett leaned forward. "Senator Cruz," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle. "I've been interrupted 6 times today. 6. And yet not once have you allowed me to finish a complete thought." The room stilled. For the first time in the exchange, the power shifted audibly. She was not raising her voice, not matching his aggression, but cutting through it with clarity sharper than any shout. Her eyes locked on his, unblinking. "If you truly want answers, you'll have to let me speak. Otherwise, this isn't a hearing. It's a monologue. And the only person performing here is you." Gasps rippled across the chamber. It wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it, with composure, with surgical precision, with the authority of someone who had endured enough interruptions to recognize the pattern and finally expose it for all to see. Cruz shifted in his chair, the confidence in his posture faltering ever so slightly. His trademark smirk wavered. For a man so accustomed to control, being called out so directly, without anger, without chaos, just truth, was disarming. But Crockett wasn't finished. She continued, her words unfolding like measured blows. "I came here to do the work the people elected me to do. They didn't send me to play games, and they certainly didn't send me to be anyone's punching bag. You can interrupt me 6 times or 60, but it won't change one thing. I will be heard." Silence fell heavy in the chamber. It was the kind of silence that only comes when a truth has been spoken so cleanly, so undeniably, that no one dares to move. Even the clicking of reporters' keyboards slowed, as if they needed to absorb every word before writing it down. Cruz opened his mouth, perhaps to interject again, but something in the air stopped him. Maybe it was the steady gaze Crockett held, or the awareness that his bluster had been cracked open before a national audience. Whatever it was, his words stalled. He closed his mouth, and then came the line. the line that would replay on every network, that would be clipped and shared across social media, that would etch itself into political memory. Crockett leaned in, her voice unwavering. Respect isn't something you seize by talking over people. It's something you earn by listening. The effect was instantaneous. The room erupted, not with noise, but with energy. A few muffled laughs of disbelief escaped from the audience, not mocking her but marveling at the precision of her strike. Staffers exchanged wide-eyed glances, their pens racing to capture the phrasing. The murmurs swelled, growing louder until even Cruz could not pretend that nothing had happened. On Twitter, the clip was already racing through timelines. On TikTok, it was being set to music, captions flashing across the screen. Respect isn't seized, it's earned. Hashtags sprouted like wildfire. Crockett clapback, mic drop moment, 7th time the charm. And at home, viewers who had been shaking their heads at each interruption now sat up straighter, nodding, smiling, clapping, at their screens as if they were in the chamber themselves. This wasn't just politics. It was validation. It was every experience of being cut off, dismissed, silenced, finally avenged in real time. Crockett had spoken not only for herself, but for them. Meanwhile, Cruz looked rattled. His hands fidgeted with his notes. His gaze darted, first at the cameras, then back to Crockett, then down at the table. The rhythm that had carried him through 6 interruptions was broken. He had been outmaneuvered not by volume, but by restraint, not by bluster, but by dignity. And that was the brilliance of it. Crockett never raised her voice, never descended into the chaos Cruz thrived on. She turned his interruptions into his undoing, exposing the emptiness behind the noise. In doing so, she flipped the entire power dynamic of the exchange. The murmurs in the chamber gave way to a hum of electricity, the kind that signals history being written in the moment. People knew they had just witnessed something unforgettable. The replay value of those words was endless, not because they were complicated, but because they were simple, human, and true. Cruz's expression hardened, a thin smile plastered across his face as though to signal composure. But the damage was done. His interruptions had been rebranded not as strength but as weakness, and Crockett's calm had crystallized into legend. This was the mic drop moment, the instant where the underdog refused to bow and, in doing so, shifted the weight of the entire narrative. And yet, as powerful as that exchange was, it was only the beginning. Because what happened inside the chamber was explosive, yes, but the true shockwave, the one that would ripple across millions of screens, ignite social media and dominate headlines, was waiting just beyond those walls. But the real shockwave wasn't in the chamber. It was what came next. The moment Jasmine Crockett delivered her mic drop line, the committee room may have fallen into silence, but outside those walls, the world was about to roar. Within minutes, the clip hit social media. Someone uploaded it to Twitter with the caption, "She shut him down with 7 words. Respect isn't seized, it's earned." It was retweeted thousands of times in the first hour. By midday, the hashtag #Crockett Clapback was trending at #1 nationwide. On TikTok, creators layered Crockett's words over dramatic music, slowed the clip down for effect, added captions that flashed with every syllable. Teenagers stitched it into their own stories of being interrupted in classrooms. Workers paired it with tales of being silenced in boardrooms. Activists turned it into rallying cries for representation and dignity. The refrain spread like wildfire. Respect isn't seized, it's earned. Memes poured out too, side-by-side screenshots of Cruz mid-interruption, his hand in the air, versus Crockett leaning forward, eyes locked, delivering her line with surgical calm. The captions wrote themselves, loud versus strong. Guess who won? On Instagram, celebrities reposted the clip, praising Crockett as a masterclass in composure. By evening, late-night hosts were already weaving the exchange into their monologues, mocking Cruz's interruptions and celebrating Crockett's restraint. Journalists picked up on the story not just for its entertainment value, but for its symbolism. Editorials ran with headlines like, "Crockett reminds America what dignity looks like," and "Why interruptions are more than rudeness, they're power plays." Commentators debated the larger meaning on cable news, some dismissing it as theatrics, others calling it a turning point in the conversation about gender and respect in politics. But it wasn't just the media elite weighing in. Everyday people flooded timelines with their own validation. Women wrote about being cut off in meetings. Immigrants spoke about being silenced in public debates. Students described being ignored in classrooms, and all of them connected their personal stories to Crockett's calm takedown of Cruz. It was no longer just her moment. It was their moment, too. Meanwhile, Cruz found himself on the wrong side of virality. Clips of his repeated interruptions spread almost as fast as Crockett's comeback, edited into compilations set to clown music, each cutoff punctuated by eye-roll emojis. Hashtags mocking him, 7 times Ted, interrupted again, ran alongside. The celebration of Crockett. Even some conservative commentators couldn't help but acknowledge that the optics had gone terribly wrong. The ripple effect was undeniable. Conversations about sexism in politics reignited. Analysts pointed out how often women, particularly women of color, are interrupted in professional and political settings. Op-eds cited studies on manterrupting, drawing direct parallels to Cruz's behavior. Crockett's words became more than a viral moment. They became a case study in what dignity under pressure looks like. And it wasn't just about gender or race. It was about power itself. Crockett had exposed in real time how arrogance crumbles when confronted by composure. She had flipped the script, turning what should have been a disadvantage, being repeatedly cut off, into the very stage on which she displayed her strength. That lesson resonated far beyond politics, reaching anyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or drowned out. The validation was overwhelming. People weren't just cheering Crockett. They were seeing themselves in her, finding hope. In her restraint, courage, in her poise. The virality wasn't powered by outrage alone. It was powered by inspiration. It was powered by the sense that justice, even in the smallest form, had triumphed in plain sight. But Crockett herself wasn't content to let the story end with a trending hashtag. She knew that moments pass quickly in the digital age and that virality can vanish as fast as it arrives. She also knew that the weight of this encounter carried something bigger, something deeper than just a meme. The people weren't only laughing at Cruz, they were looking to her for meaning, for leadership, for a universal lesson they could carry forward, and Jasmine Crockett was ready to give them one. Yet Crockett didn't stop at a viral moment. She turned it into a universal truth. In the hours and days after the clip of Jasmine Crockett's exchange with Ted Cruz swept across the nation, she did something remarkable. She didn't gloat. She didn't amplify the mockery of Cruz or revel in the viral storm. Instead, she reframed the entire moment, lifting it from the realm of partisan bickering into something bigger, something that spoke to justice, respect, and the very heart of what it means to be American. When reporters asked her about the confrontation, she didn't talk about winning a sparring match. She spoke about dignity. "This isn't about me and Senator Cruz," she explained in one interview. "It's about how we choose to treat one another, especially when we disagree. Respect is not weakness. It's the foundation of democracy." That tone, measured, moral, unshakably steady, was the same one she carried in the chamber. Crockett wasn't interested in making Cruz the villain of the story. She wanted the focus on the principle. In doing so, she transcended the moment. She showed the country that this wasn't just about a hearing gone off the rails. It was about the timeless struggle between arrogance and dignity, between loudness and strength, and that's what gave the exchange its staying power. It wasn't simply entertaining. it was instructive. People replayed her words not only because they enjoyed seeing Cruz silenced, but because they recognized a deeper truth. That truth was universal. No matter who you are, no matter where you come from, your voice matters. You have the right to be heard. And when someone tries to take that from you, composure is more powerful than rage. Crockett's calm strength turned into a symbol. For immigrants, it was a reminder that belonging is not granted by those in power. It is affirmed in the courage to stand firm. For women, especially women of color, it was validation that the struggle against being silenced is not theirs alone, and that their dignity can redefine the terms of every conversation. For students, workers, parents, for anyone who had ever been told to stay quiet, it was proof that silence can be broken not with shouting but with conviction. The lesson rang clear: dignity outlasts arrogance. Arrogance may dominate a room for a moment, but dignity echoes far longer, rippling outward until it becomes something unstoppable. Crockett's words became more than a clapback. They became a creed. And in that creed was a vision of Americanness, not tied to bluster or domination, but to respect, listening, and the shared belief that every person deserves a seat at the table. It was in this reframing that Crockett elevated herself from participant to example. She wasn't just another politician in a viral clash. She became an emblem of calm strength, the kind that cannot be shouted down, the kind that inspires others to hold their ground in their own lives. She reminded the country that the truest form of power isn't the ability to interrupt. It's the ability to endure, to wait, and then to speak truth so clearly it cannot be ignored. And in that sense, the moment was never really about Cruz at all. He became a footnote, the backdrop against which Crockett's message shone brighter. What people carried away wasn't his interruptions, it was her resilience. What lingered wasn't his arrogance, it was her dignity. This wasn't just politics. It was life. It was the story of every worker spoken over in a meeting, every student brushed aside in a classroom, every parent dismissed at a town hall. It was the story of every person who had ever felt invisible, told their voice didn't count, only to discover that calm conviction can move mountains. And that's why, when the echoes of the hearing faded and the hashtags eventually slowed, Crockett's words remained. They had tapped into something larger, something timeless. She had reminded America, and reminded the world, that strength is not measured by how loudly you interrupt, but by how firmly you stand. This wasn't just about politics, but about every person who has ever been spoken over and refused to be silenced. 6 interruptions. 1 legendary takedown. That's what the nation witnessed when Jasmine Crockett refused to let arrogance drown out her voice. What began as yet another spectacle of bluster and interruption transformed into a defining moment of calm strength, a reminder that dignity doesn't need to shout, it only needs to stand firm. The clash between Cruz and Crockett was more than political theater. It was a mirror reflecting the deeper struggles we face every day. The battles over respect, over who gets heard, over whose voices are valued in the halls of power and beyond. Crockett showed us that resilience is not silence, that composure is not weakness. She proved that in a world where arrogance tries to seize the stage, dignity can still claim the spotlight. And that lesson belongs to all of us. Because each time someone is interrupted, dismissed, or spoken over, the choice arises: lash out or stand strong. Crockett's example reminds us that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it waits, it endures, and then it speaks with clarity that cannot be ignored. So let this moment live beyond the headlines. Let it be a spark for every worker in a meeting, every student in a classroom, every citizen demanding their voice be heard. 6 interruptions may try to break you, but all it takes is one moment of clarity, one stand for dignity, to turn the tide. If this inspired you, share it, because dignity deserves a spotlight. And together, by lifting these stories higher, we remind the world that respect is not seized, through arrogance. It's earned through truth, through courage, and through the unshakable belief that every voice matters.